Our learning objective 4 is another measure of this kind of leverage analysis, and that's why we put it here. It's liquidity and solvency, and those words may sound very similar to you, understandably, but they're technically different. Liquidity means, can you pay your upcoming bills very safely, right? So it's more near term. Solvency means, are you able to pay your debt over time? Do you have a risk of default? So we look at mostly the time dimension when we look at these two. And this is our focus on this section, and it flows directly from leverage. All right, we'll start with liquidity analysis, and we'll do two ratios. The first is current ratio, and the other is the quick, sometimes called the acid test ratio. Current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. Very easy to find, right? Because balance sheets have a subtotal in assets called current assets. They have a subtotal in liabilities called current liabilities, and you divide one by the other and you have the current ratio. So let's go back to interpretation using the number 1. 1 means that the bills you have due within the next year, current liabilities, exactly equal the amount of assets you have in 1 year, current assets. And 1 is a little dangerous, right? You would love to have more assets than what you owe. So that's why we interpret this typically, rule of thumb like, of 2. If you have double the amount of assets that you have in liabilities for the upcoming year, you're good. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're below 2, you're bad. It just means that you have to sharpen your pencils. You have to be better at managing your receivables and your working capital. So I would say 2 or above is kind of safe. Below 2, it bears further analysis. Now, go to the right side and we look at quick ratio. Notice the numerator. It has the most liquid of the liquid. So among the current assets, it only counts cash, marketable securities, and receivables, which means it's already cash, or you could convert it to cash by calling a broker and selling your securities, or your customers just have to pay you and you have cash. So when we use this as a denominator, it's a tougher test than all current assets, as we did with the current ratio. So the denominator is the same. Now, back to number 1. If the quick ratio is 1, that means all our liabilities in the next year will be paid by simply using our cash, our securities, or our receivables. That's why the rule of thumb for the quick ratio has historically been 1. If you have really fast cash able to equal 1 year's worth of payables and liabilities, well, that sounds pretty good. Again, it doesn't mean that if you're below 1.0 that things are bad. It just means it's a question mark and you need to investigate further. Next, we look at solvency, which is this notion of longer term debt. And two, 1 is the ratio of total liabilities divided by shareholders' equity. We talked about this a moment ago, and means for every dollar of equity, what do we have in assets? And 1 is modest, and higher would be more leverage, lower would be under 1. Times interest earned is your ability from EBIT to cover your interest, and we want this number high, as we mentioned earlier. So when we look at industries, we'll see very widely differing economics. So here we have an array on the bottom of industries, and on the vertical axis, the amount of liabilities to equity. And look at the top number, it's 4. 4 means you have 4 times the liabilities as you have equity, which means a little bit of equity and a lot of debt. Way on the other side, with newspapers, it's under 0.5, which means they have very little debt. So these tend to be financed solely from owners. And so when you do analysis, there's no absolute right answer. You need to analyze the company and how it's trending by itself. And you have to compare a company with its competitors or the industry. This is why our financial analysis project has both analysis of a company, the one you chose, and a benchmark against somebody else, because we don't know industries enough to be able to look at a number and see how good it is. It helps to benchmark against another. In class, we talked about Nike and benchmarking Nike with Under Armour, right? So in Intel's case, you would benchmark Intel against its largest competitor, Advanced Micro Devices, AMD. So that's why we do industry benchmarks. Next is vertical and horizontal analysis. This is learning objective 5. And this looks at the dimension of either time, where we spread across columns, time, or the columns represent different competitors. So now again, we're trying to do some benchmarking so that we can evaluate 1 year of data rather than in isolation. So vertical means we're going this way. And vertical looks at balance sheets as a percent of assets and income statements as a percent of sales. We'll look at these in a moment. And we call this common sizing. We common size so that we can more easily see the relationships of numbers within those columns. The other method of analysis is horizontal, this way. And usually this means a time dimension. So looking at a company and how its ratios evolve over time gives you a sense of whether things are getting better or worse or mixed. So let's look at some examples. Intel balance sheet. On the left side here, on these 3 columns, these are the raw dollar amounts, and on the right side are percentages. Balance sheets are always divided by total assets. So that's why assets is 100%, which means everything above it shows the composition. So in Intel's case, well, how much do they have in property, plant, and equipment? Answer, 30 cents of every dollar of assets is in PP&E, which is down in 2015 from what it was in 2013 of 34. So they're getting leaner and meaner, right? So that's an easy calculation. Look at cash. Cash used to be only 6%, and now it's 14. Whoa, they have a lot of cash, right? So it's, again, an easy way to analyze. Then we go to the bottom here. It shows you where did the money come from. It says, okay, out of 100% of all the financing, in this case, 60% dropping down to 59% comes from equity, which means they have a modest amount of debt and a fairly healthy amount of equity. That's how we use it. Very easy to interpret and powerful again. Now we'll look at Intel's income statement. Here again, left side raw data, right side percentages. Percent of what? Percent of sales. Now everything below is stated as a percent of sales. So just give you a couple of examples. Gross margin went from 59 to 63. For every dollar of sales, their profit is actually rising. That's a good trend. The bottom line went from 18 to 20. So again, despite some very strong sales performance, we're talking in the billions, $55 billion in sales, they're actually making more dollars for every dollars of sales. So this is a company that is very strong and is at scale and is taking advantage of it. Now, all the other numbers that I have not highlighted are like expenses. How much do they spend on R&D? Well, for every dollar of sales, they spend 22 cents on R&D. So that's a pretty heavy investment if you think about it. 20% of your revenues you invest in the future doing research. In a tech company, that is not unusual, and if Intel did not do research, they would be caught flat-footed by their competitors. So it's not a luxury, it's a requirement in technology to be strong in research and development.